Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about this JCPOA or P5+1 formula that in fact was initiated way back, and then we got to know that the Americans in fact surprisingly, along with the other members of the P5, interestingly they all in fact said that whatever Iran is doing, they will do it, but there are certain conditions attached to it. For example, regarding the enrichment of the uranium, it was limited at 5%. Then you move on and you'll see that everything went on pretty well, and we all thought and we all really appreciated that Mr. Jawad Zarif, who was then the foreign minister, we all said that, you know, this man has done a brilliant job, I think one of the best negotiator, and eventually everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. But right after that, this was the time when Mr. Barack Obama was the President of the United States of America. Later on, again, once Mr. Trump took charge, everything was reversed. The sanctions were imposed again. The problems were there for the Iranians. They could not export their oil, they could not export their gas, not even the precious metals. No major option was left with them. Now, the interesting part was that it led to a lot of confusion, a lot of mistrust, but eventually now this process has started again. The only problem which seems to be there is that Mr. Jawad Zarif is not among those who are negotiating, but there is a new group of individuals who are negotiating with the West. They believe that it's now or never kind of a situation. Either it is going to be resolved according to the wishes of the West and the Iranians, and it could be a win-win situation for both the parties, while the other option is that if it is delayed, then this is going to be a problem. And that is the actual issue rather at the moment. As far as Iran is concerned, I think they are still in the FATF's blacklist and still going through a lot of turmoil, a lot of problem. Whether you talk about the current standard of the machinery that is being used in extracting oil and gas and other, I would say, metals for that matter, they really need to revive. I still remember Mr. Rouhani once was traveling right after this huge success when it was given a green signal, and he ordered around 500 jets. He landed in Italy, I remember, ordered. He went to France and he ordered Boeings there, and obviously with the Americans he had some decent deals there as well. But having said that, everything was reversed, back to square one. Now, what is the current situation? What exactly is happening? Where these talks stand at the moment? We'll be talking about that. But before I introduce to the panelists, our production team has prepared a report. Let's watch that first, and we'll talk after that.
Iran, United States, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom are diplomatically struggling to develop a consensus to reach on a nuclear deal and revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran is solely focused on being freed from the US economic sanctions, and the United States and other concerned world stakeholders are making sure that Iran must obliterate its nuclear enrichment goals and activities. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Saeed recently said that reaching a good deal is possible, but three key issues still remain to be resolved. He added that the United States and European powers have not taken political decisions on these major issues. Saeed Khatibzadeh, regarding these issues, said that the United States has already walked away from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and Iran now wants assurances that it won't happen again. He also declared that everyone has its own plan B and asserted that Iran is willing but will not wait forever. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian stated that Iran's lead nuclear negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani is in contact with European Union's Enrique Mora. Amir Abdullahian added that Iran's red lines are made very clear to the Western parties, and Iran is ready to immediately conclude a good deal, though the other side must show the real will. On the other hand, United States State Department spokesperson Ned Price said that United States is prepared to walk away if Iran displays an intransigence to making progress.
Now, to talk about this, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Nasir Khan Saab, former ambassador. Thank you very much, sir, for your time. And we also have with us Dr. Rizwana Abbasi. She is the head of international Relations, NUML University, and expert on global nuclear and strategic issues. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your time as well. And on Skype from Tehran, Iran, we have with us Mr. Ghanbar Naderi. He's a senior journalist. Naisab, pleasure to have you in the show, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Now, if you allow me, ma'am and sir, I'll put the first question to our guest from Tehran, and we'll just take the update that what exactly is happening and what is the status of the negotiations so far. Mr. Naderi, your take.
Faisal, as you just mentioned earlier, it is Iran is more than ever determined to revive the nuclear deal with the world powers, the so-called JCPOA. Iran paid a heavy cost over the past few years since the former president Donald Trump's administration decided to walk out of the nuclear deal and impose and reimpose all kinds of sanctions against Iran, the so-called crippling sanctions. Still, Iran believes in diplomacy and dialogue, and that's why it has sent representatives of its new administration to Vienna to make sure that this deal is somehow revived no matter what. So Iran is more than ever willing to revive the deal. It is now up to the international community, especially the United States, to come to its senses and realize that the only way forward is a dialogue, and that antagonization or endless enmity towards Iran is not going to contain Iran's nuclear program. Let's not forget the fact that Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei has made it absolutely clear through a religious decree that all nuclear weapons are banned in Iran and that Iran has no intention whatsoever to build any nuclear bomb. So the stakes are high, not just for Iran, but for the international community and, of course, the United States government, the Biden administration. They have already made it absolutely clear that they want to revive the deal, and let's cross our fingers and hope that there will be a new deal, revived JCPOA, that will come out of the Vienna talks that are still ongoing. Iran doesn't want to leave Vienna without a new deal. Iran knows that the stakes are still high, all because of the fact that we now have a crisis in Ukraine or a war between Ukraine and Russia. But Iran doesn't believe that this is going to affect the outcome of the Vienna talks. So Iran is ready and more than ever serious. Let's hope that Washington is also ready, because the remaining signatories of to the JCPOA, the European Union, Russia, and China are also more than ever ready to make sure that this particular deal is revived. So there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, definitely there is light at the end of the tunnel, but interestingly, if you remember, when this particular contract or agreement was signed between Iran and among various other P5+1 countries, if you remember, at that time the Prime Minister in Israel was Benjamin Netanyahu, and he went all the way to America and he met the congressmen there and he delivered a speech which was totally anti-Obama, if you remember. And after that, things did take a turn, which were pretty much against Iran. Now, this time, looking at the current crisis in Europe, and I'm talking about the Ukrainian crisis, do you think the kind of statements that are being issued by the senior leadership of Iran, which are pretty anti-USA, I mean, I'm sure, on that particular issue, do you think that could create a problem as well?
Not at all, because all these rhetoric and statements against the ongoing nuclear talks are just for domestic consumption. The Iranian economy is suffering. The Iranian people are suffering because they are the main targets of the US-led sanctions against Iran. And whatever you hear from the Iranian capital that comes out of the mouths of certain Iranian officials is only for domestic consumption. They are more than happy to revive the deal. They are more than happy to be in Vienna, and they want to make sure that sanctions are lifted. And they are more than ever, as I told you, ready to return to the nuclear deal. They are also willing to reduce the volume of uranium enrichment below 4%. Because, as I told you, as per a religious decree by the Iranian leader, Iran has no intention whatsoever to build a nuclear bomb. But as I told you, but this is not just about Iran. This is also about the United States. They should also show some kind of political willing and seriousness that this time, when they sign the deal and return to the deal, they won't walk out. And this includes the next American government.
All right. Now, Nasab, a couple of questions here now. If you remember, sir, IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, they played a very important role. And they were very much satisfied with all what Iran was supposed to do, and they did. But, sir, the only factor was perhaps the Israeli pressure. The lobby of these Israelis, it's very strong, as we all know, and they persuaded the government and I would say the movers and the shakers over there, and eventually it was reversed. Now, sir, again, it seems that most of these countries, whether it's Germany or UK or France or China or Russia, they would agree to it. European Union would agree to it. But Americans could create a problem once again, sir. Your take.
You see, as far as the nuclear deal is concerned, the JCPOA, I think Iran has shown a sincerity of purpose. Iran has agreed to reduce the stockpile of nuclear material from 10,000 kilograms to 300 kilograms. That's like a 90% reduction. And if today, with this status, they were to try and even develop a weapon, it would take them about a year to get enough material together. They have also agreed to reduce the amount of refinement to about 3.67%. Again, they have also allowed UN inspectors to come in at any time, and they've reduced the production of centrifuges from 19,000 to about 5,000. So on that, in that respect, they have been sincere in convincing the rest of the world that they are not going to develop a nuclear weapon. In exchange for that, they are getting the lifting of sanctions, both political, economic, and energy sanctions. So now, since America walked out of the deal in 2018, there have been some further sanctions. And right now, the sticking point, I would say that there are three sticking points. Iran wants, number one, for sanctions which were added after 2018 to be lifted immediately. And those are especially the ones that they insist upon since the last trip of Mr. Bakri to Tehran, is to lift the sanctions on the IRGC. You know, the IRGC plays an important role in Iran, and it is not only a military power, but now very strong political power, as well as an economic giant. You know, some say it controls almost 40% of industry or economy over there. So this is something which Iran is going to try to insist upon. The other is the guarantees that nobody will again in future renege on this agreement that they hope to
so if it's finalized, let's stick to it.
Yes. Now, the most important problem, I mean the biggest problem there, is that it is an agreement, it is not a treaty. So in the United States, according to law, no president can compel following presidents to stick to an agreement that he has made. Treaty is different. If you have a treaty, then the treaty has to be ratified by at least 2/3 of the Senate. And under the circumstances, that seems highly unlikely. So what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, it is, in my opinion, rather unfair that sanctions that were imposed after 2018 are not lifted, because it was an agreement, the United States walked out of it, and it was a solid agreement that would have worked. So if you want something to come about now, I think the simplest thing is to quickly go back to the original and talk about the conditions there. You see, otherwise...
That makes more sense.
Yes. So the guarantee part of it, I think, will be very difficult in practical terms. The IRGC sanctions ought to be lifted. I
But
don't know what their response
when we
will
say the
be.
P5+1, Germany is added there.
Yes.
So is it more or less like the Security Council where anybody can veto?
No, not at all.
So when so many countries have agreed, why the Americans are still hesitant?
Well, the sanctions primarily are moved and imposed by the United States and others follow. So that is a real fact, right? But when you talk about the P5+1, I personally feel that apart from the fact that under the circumstances in the Ukraine, the Europeans are certainly busy elsewhere, although some of them are in a hurry to try and conclude this, which I frankly don't agree with, because when you talk about the P5+1, I think when you're looking at the region, you ought to have other players on the table as well, the regional players of Iran, which may be the Arabs, Pakistan, and even Israel. Why not? Because these talks, for them to be...
Because they have got some legitimate concerns as well.
They have stakes, they have concerns, but everything should be done through such negotiations.
Correct.
You see, so that is very, very important.
All right. Now, let's keep the uranium enrichment or the number of centrifuges you plan to develop, I mean, on one side. Ma'am, one of the issue is that Revolutionary Guards, we all know that they hold very important positions. They have held very important positions in the past also. Some of the senior members belong to this group. Now, this particular organization has been listed as a terrorist organization, and this is one of the major problems there as well. And then comes the other part. Ma'am, how important this issue could be, because it seems that the Americans in particular, and Europeans obviously, generally, they would not accept them as something which is very normal. They have considered them because obviously that they think that this could be the major threat emanating from Iran.
Thank you. First of all, this issue was not added to the pledges that they made in the first place. This was not added to the conditions in the agreement that was crafted in 2015 and implemented in 2016. But the question is that I think this was a landmark, classic global example. This agreement was classic global example of negotiated settlement and diplomacy in the 21st century. I think what I would say is that this particular I would say agreement dealt with non-compliance related issues, but I think we are adding more issues into it instead of linking issues not related to the agreement. We need to delink these issues, and we need to set up some other platforms where we can negotiate on regional security related conditions, regional security related issues, proxies related issues that they have concerns, and then of course this particular organization we are talking about, they are declared it as terrorist organization. So I think these are the issues that can bilaterally or trilaterally or at the multilateral level on different forum can be discussed. But what we are talking about right now is that the restoration of JCPOA. If JCPOA urgently is not restored, then of course we are seeing urgent emerging humanitarian crisis in Iran. So because right now we see Iran in depression, in recession, in inflation, and in of course currency depreciation. So these all are directly these crippling sanctions that they have imposed since 2018 are really directly impacting human security. So right now I think I would say that what we need to do is that we immediately need to set this example, restore the JCPOA and lift sanctions and then cooperate.
That is an ideal case scenario, ma'am.
Curtail Iranian nuclear program. Otherwise, if they actually we fail to restore probably JCPOA, current global intensified crisis situation suggests Iran might leave NPT, and in turn then of course Iran will turn into a threshold nuclear weapon state. So then no can then bar Iran from going nuclear. It is their legitimate right to maximize their self-defense. So then of course considering current global evolving patterns, arms racing problems, growing proliferation trends, these suggest that of course then states will be compelled to go nuclear.
Now one important point, and I really want you to throw light on that. I mean, whether you talk about, let me name a few countries: Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia. I mean, these are the countries under sanctions. and heavy,
And
crippling
sanctions,
sanctions, as you say. But ma'am, interestingly, uh, these are all those countries which are pretty anti-USA. So USA is one country which at the end of the day matters whether we like it or we don't. Now, Mr. Raisi, the president, the current president, he's a hardliner. And this man is going to be the future supreme leader also. So considering this particular equation, ma'am, do you think that there is even slight possibility that this JCPOA could be restored in its true spirit?
I'm quite hopeful. I'm quite hopeful because you see, only US has withdrawn from the JCPOA, not the EU members and not the other UN Security Council members are Germany. So indirectly, there are negotiations between US and Iran, and I think the other members will play a role. And Joe Biden himself also has demonstrated clearly that they want to restore the JCPOA. But the major aim and the focus of US and of course international players is to, as I said, curb Iranian program. And Iran also, I mean, IAEA has, in the, in 2018, they have implemented very stringent monitoring mechanism and verification mechanism to, the
IAEA
fuel
members,
cycle under
whoever
surveillance
visited,
system.
I mean, they were pretty happy with it.
Yeah, they actually produced reports that Iran is in compliance and is actually meeting their pledges and fulfilling their agreement that they signed in the first place. But the question is then, of course, President Trump, he had major issues related to his missile program, and then of course their role that they play in, for US, that the role, that spoilers role that they play in the broader region. But now the question is that Iranian missile program can be dealt in segregated form and separately. That should not be a part of the agreement. Of course, Iran was, embargoes were lifted, under the JCPOA agreement, that Iran can actually, strike deals, conventional weapons related deals and missile related deals with, trade related deals with other countries. But now the question arises that, of course, considering evolving security situation in the region, Iran does require, a missile system for its self-defense, and that is conventional capability. So Iran says that Iran is not planning on it, is not, going nuclear. But then the question arises that, of course, if you really want to cap proliferation, further, cap for the rising proliferation trend, then we will have to cooperate with Iran and we will have to lift sanctions. If they lift sanctions, then of course that will ease the broader region as well. Of course, this will then help a lot Pakistan and other relevant bordering countries, because of course we are now planning on, building regional connectivity, and that would open corridors not only for the West, for Europe, but also for all the regional countries.
And interestingly, when the Chinese have said that they will be investing somewhat like $400 billion in the next 25 years. And if you just divide it, I mean, it comes to around $4 every 3 months, every quarter. So that's a lot of money they're looking at. But another, again, I mean, icing on the cake is that Ned Price, in fact, recently said that, rather he warned, I mean, that was the statement. He said that alternatives, he has warned of the alternatives if Iran is unwilling to engage in good faith. So this good faith, can you explain me that? I mean, what exactly are they looking at? What exactly do they want to know? And secondly, if this particular negotiation, I mean, if it is failed, then the problem will start. It's for you.
Well, the good faith is all about Iran stop enriching uranium above 4%, and at the same time Iran having some kind of understanding and dialogue with its neighbors. The good news, as your distinguished guest made it absolutely clear, Iran is more than willing to normalize its relations with its neighbors, especially its Arab neighbors. Remember, the renewal of the JCPOA is even welcomed by Israel, Iran's arch enemy. So if that is the case, why on earth should Iran to go the other way, the opposite way? That is not the case. Remember, it is not just Iran that is suffering, it's also the region that is suffering. If Iran is unable to have a normal trade relations with its neighbors and beyond, others are going also to pay the price. And that's precisely what they have been doing in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So if you want to stop that, you need to revive the nuclear deal. And if you revive the nuclear deal, Iran will Iran will definitely behave like a normal state as its neighbors, because Iran, at the end of the day, is a very economically minded nation. Iran wants to trade. Iran wants to sell its oil and gas and other products. Iran wants to see that all these products, when they are sold, it is able to get the money back through the SWIFT system and more. And if that is the case, I don't see any reason why. I don't see any excuses for Iran, even the hardliners, to go the extra mile and antagonize Iran's neighbors and the international community. No, that is not. That is never going to happen. Remember, as I told you, it was the U.S. that walked out of the nuclear deal. Iran never did try to violate the deal until Trump decided to walk out and reimpose his so-called crippling sanctions. Iran had to react. Iran had no choice for domestic consumption, to maintain its posture and influence in the region and beyond. Pakistan would have done the same thing. Turkey would have done the same thing. Arab countries would have done the same thing. So, and Iran is no exception. I am positive, as your guests made it absolutely clear, Iran wants to revive the deal. Iran has no intention to build nuclear weapons or threaten its neighbors. That is not the case. Iran has never tried to violate the terms of the agreement. Iran has never ever tried to invade its neighbors over the past 200 years or so. Why on earth should it do now?
But there's a problem. You talk about Yemen, you'll see the involvement of the Iranians. You talk about the proxies in the Middle East, whether it's Syria or Iraq, you'll see the role of the Iranians, or perhaps they're blamed for it. Now the issue is that since we have noticed during the last couple of years, especially during the time of Donald Trump, that the relationship between the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain for that matter, Oman, they are getting very close to Israel. So what is that supposed to mean when you look at this current equation and this particular pact?
If the nuclear deal is revived, Iran has made it again absolutely clear that it is open to talks about other regional issues. But put yourself in Iran's shoes. If the deal is not revived, there is no reason whatsoever for Iran to talk about other issues. So if the sanctions are lifted, the deal is revived, Iran is more than ever willing and determined to talk about other issues in the region. Iran will definitely put pressure on its proxies in Yemen to end the current war. Iran will definitely make sure that peace and stability returns to Syria, even though Iran was not the country that invaded Syria in the first place. And you can talk about other issues. Even Israel. Iran has never, ever tried to weaponize its, negative relations with Israel by building nuclear bombs. Even Israel is now backing the revival of the nuclear deal. Why? Because it serves the interests of the regional community. That's why Iran has no choice but to sit and continue the ongoing talks and make sure that something positive comes out of the ongoing the negotiations in Vienna. Iran is going to win. Its neighbors are going to win, and there will definitely be much more regional stability and security for everyone across the Middle East and beyond. And let's face it, what is going on in Ukraine is not what the region wants. It's not what Iran wants. We don't want to see that. We don't want to see another war, another endless carnage and chaos in the Middle East. Iran has paid billions of dollars for what is going on in the region, and which is not even its own fault. So why Iran should continue? Iran doesn't have the money to continue and suffer more. So Iran is more than ever willing to show some kind of goodwill gesture. The hope is that America will show the same kind of thing, because its regional allies are supporting the ongoing talks, and they want to make sure that Iran will never ever build a nuclear bomb.
All right. Now coming to you, Nasir, Ali Bagheri Khani, who is the current chief negotiator. Earlier it was Jawad Zarif Saab. Now the interesting part is, sir, the West. Let me put it this way: the West is blaming him that now this man has become, or Tehran has become, more uncompromising. I mean, they're coming up with new demands and everything. So, do you think the Iran is trying to take advantage of the current global scenario, sir? Or is it perhaps something else?
You see, if there's sincerity of purpose on both sides,
That's why they said, in good faith.
in good faith, if there is sincerity of purpose on both sides, finally you will come to a deal. But what we need to understand is the current situation vis-a-vis the Ukraine, one should not rush this deal, to happen in the next week or so, and if it doesn't, then it's a complete failure.
Now or never, that's what they say.
Yes, that is the way.
That's
of
what
putting
Iranians
pressure.
say.
That's a way of putting pressure from both sides. Now it's a negotiation, and so each side is going to try and extract as much benefit from it as possible. But there is no doubt in my mind that the Iranians are sincere, and also that the Biden administration does want to come to a deal. Now you have to look at the practical aspects. If you make a demand that cannot be met, then obviously there will be a stalemate. But that doesn't mean that the talks need to completely fail and you need to give up on the process. The process ought to continue. There is no reason that it doesn't continue for the next few weeks or a few months, because it'll give you a chance to realize what is practical and what is not. If you make a demand which is impossible, like you're talking about guarantees from the United States, it will not be possible under the circumstances. This government...
And why so?
Because unless you have a treaty, the next president is not bound by this agreement. There's a difference between a treaty and an agreement.
Yeah.
And in order to have a treaty, that treaty has to be ratified by two-thirds of the Senate. They don't even have two-thirds majority in the Senate. So
it's 50-50.
No, not only that. You already hear voices from Republican senators who are not even interested in having this negotiation. You see, so that's impossible. But I do believe that both sides do want a deal, and they are simply parrying like two boxers do. They want to get as much advantage as they can extract. But to be fair, there are some things, like as I mentioned, the sanctions that came after this. The United States ought to lift those sanctions right away. There is no reason. And also, while negotiations are going on, there is no reason why Iran cannot say, well, we have stopped further enrichment. Or if you're saying we have already drawn back to 3.6%.
Is it about the trust deficit, sir?
Indeed, there is always trust deficit.
From both sides.
But yes, but then each side has an interest in having this deal. What is the alternative that the United States have? What pressure can it put on Iran to stop this, apart from a military attack or something, right? That is extremely dangerous. That is something which is extremely dangerous. What interest does Iran have? Iran's economy is in a shambles. They have opportunities to be part of the international community and the international trade. And what Mr. Naderi said, a very important point, is that once you get this deal, then you can start another negotiation on what you call the involvement of Iran, whether it is in Iraq, whether it is in Syria, whether it is in Lebanon, or whether it is in Yemen. So that is something that might come out which is quite positive. Now the United States should also put pressure on Israel.
Sir, Iran and the late General Soleimani, if I'm not wrong, sir.
Yes.
That man was known for his proxies in the region, sir. That is perhaps one of the reasons he was eliminated.
Yes.
Then the Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated. So this is what the Americans are doing, sir. They have done it.
Apart from that, there were people who were killed, senior officers have been killed in Lebanon, in Syria.
That's what I'm saying. But the point is, sir, that then, I mean, this is going to continue.
Well, I'm hoping it does not. I'm saying that the US
The Iranians
should
were also blamed for supplying the small missiles to the Palestinians to attack on the border area of Israel.
Yes, of course.
So this is something which is not going to be acceptable to anybody.
They have been known to assist both the Hezbollah and the Hamas. There's no doubt. But, you know, the United States ought to prevail upon Israel to also come to the table regarding all these issues in its
So
immediate
the
vicinity.
new regimes in Israel as well as in USA, do you
Yes.
think they would agree to that?
Well, they need to make the effort because, you know, to bring peace in the Middle East, the main thorn is the rivalry or the enmity between Iran and Israel. Primarily, if you look at any large country, most of them have either been neutralized or are now on friendly terms with Israel, right? So the only issue that's left is that with Iran. Why isn't the international community trying to compel Israel to come to the table and talk about this? When they have said, if their main fear is that Iran will develop nuclear weapons, first of all, the world knows that Israel already has nuclear weapons,
There you
okay?
go.
But that's another story. But if that is their main fear, they should be involved in these negotiations so
Then
that they are
if
also
they are involved,
convinced.
then these negotiations will definitely get derailed.
No, not just these negotiations. I'm not talking about these negotiations.
Or any negotiation regarding Iran. Let me put it this way, sir.
Because right now, Israel is behaving like a spoiler. They have already...
They have always done that.
Exactly. So it is for the international community, the Western world, to try and convince them also. I mean, the very fact that the Biden administration wants to come back to the GCPOA is a move that they have made against the wishes of Israel, right? So they have certain priorities that are above those of Israel in the region, okay? So that means it is also in their interest
But
to
don't you
have
think
peace.
Israel is already on board, sir?
If
No?
it is,
No,
if it is, I hope you're right.
Then issues would be taken care of. Ma'am, your take on the same point, please.
Yeah, I think Israel is putting a lot of pressure. I would say that Israel and Saudi Arabia are the two main factors that are probably delaying the process.
And the last
Secondly,
2 years'
yeah.
developments that we have witnessed, they have
Yeah.
really brought these two countries
Somehow,
so
I
close.
think Israel did convince President Trump to withdraw from this particular agreement. And more so, I would say that both the sides need to really demonstrate flexibility and make some compromises in order to restore the original JCPOA. That is the fundamental,
Got
I
it.
would say, concern. And our concern is that need to be restored in the first place. Secondly, there is huge trust deficit, particularly after they selectively engage these two personalities you talked about, their scientist and of course Soleimani. So of course that trust deficit probably will be mitigated once the JCPOA is restored. Thirdly, as I highlighted that Iranian nation, people of Iran are suffering badly, and the entire region is suffering badly, considering after COVID, the food crisis, the humanitarian crisis that we see across the border in the region and globally. So I think the international community right now has got some obligation to meet. They need to come forward. They need to restore the agreement. They need to lift sanctions, and they also need to release even FATF Pakistan being part of the FATF. So I think they need to really show some solidarity and need to really demonstrate some gestures, positive gestures, thereby rescuing states from economic crisis. So I would say that I'm quite hopeful. I think that EU partners and other P51, of course, other partners as part of P51 and the IAEA would somehow or the other convince Joe Biden to restore it. And IAEA as an agency did play, as you yourself highlighted, a very significant role.
Yep.
Their monitoring role is very significant, and the commission that they set up on top of this P51 was also pretty satisfied. That need to be set up again. So that commission basically used to report to the IAEA board of the governors and to the United Nations Security Council. They themselves highlighted there were no breaches, so Iran was fulfilling its commitments. But nevertheless, current crisis need to be, as Ambassador Saab very rightly pointed out, need to be discussed, negotiated as part of the process in a segregated form after restoring the JCPOA. So in my view, I think I'm quite hopeful. I look forward to the international community to demonstrate positive outcomes and to rescue Iran from this
If you
particular
remember,
crisis.
when this JCPOA, this deal was, once it was concluded, I still remember in most of the newspapers, the headlines, they were about the deal of the century. if you remember, sir. The
Indeed.
deal of, and everybody was like, how come this has happened? Because nobody was that hopeful at that time. But at the end of the day, since at that time, the negotiating person was a great champion.
Yeah, it's all about the personalities. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
and
very right.
he did a brilliant job. This man isn't there anymore in this deal.
Yeah.
But the Iranians, on the other hand, they are trying to put more pressure. They're adding few more of their points.
I
So
think
do
they
you
need
think,
to.
are they trying to, in fact, negotiate from a position of strength, the Iranians?
I think I think Iranians need to make some compromises
They
instead
would
of
have to.
pinching on and following hardliners approach. They need to really come up with a more flexible kind of approach in order to, as I said, restore the JCPOA. On the other hand, I mean, President Biden.
What are the areas where you believe they can compromise?
I mean, they need to open up their facilities for the investigation and verification
They
of
did
the
that
IAEA.
earlier also?
Yeah, and secondly, of course, they cannot make any compromises on production and building up of their missile system, ballistic missile system. That is where they need to really clearly talk about it, and they need to be given that kind of leverage to build their, conventional deterrence at least. So that is their legitimate right. And thirdly, I think
Their
I would say
legitimate
that
right is also
I
to
think
use
thirdly-
this nuclear facility for peaceful purposes, for medicine, for agriculture, for that matter, so much more.
Absolutely, absolutely. So of course, when they open up facilities for the IAEA's monitoring system and safeguard system and of course investigation, then of course it means that they are open to use program for socioeconomic growth and research and development. So that actually they have that,
yes,
that
indeed.
right under the NPT, non-proliferation treaty, because they are member party to the NPT treaty and they adhere to the NPT, guidelines. But more so, I would say that as you very rightly pointed out, the personalities are very important. And Joe Biden also,
Because
and the
when you
US
look at the body
understands
language, you could tell
that Trump,
where is it leading.
by withdrawing from this particular agreement, Trump has also become an isolationist, and Trump has also created trust deficit between EU partners and the US. I would say at that part, and the alliance system is of course badly affected. So I think, in my view, it's behind the scene, EU wants to restore the JCPOA, and of course there are huge stakes involved between Iran and the EU. Also economic stakes are involved. So there are huge trade flow restored after they implemented the JCPOA between trade skyrocketed between EU members and Iran at that particular time. So then of course I mean there was flow of economy, trade and so on, and transactions, so on and so forth. So I mean somehow I would not say that it directly really impacted positively conditions of Iranian people, but we were on the way. We were like, I mean, everything opened up. But nevertheless, of course, all of a sudden Trump as a personality, he came back and he scuttled many other agreements, not only the JCPOA but also a couple of agreements with Russia too, for example INF treaty, so on and so forth. And they
But the whole world, you'd start from NAFTA to bringing in climate change to this NATO's money. We wanted that every country should spend 2.5% of their GDP in NATO's, and starting from China to God knows what and what not. He really did a lot of
but furthermore, I think as the Iranian colleague highlighted, that their position on Ukraine should not really affect this agreement.
International
This should
affairs,
be issue-based.
as you know, I mean,
Instead
these
of
things do matter.
Yeah, this should be issue-based.
A positive statement in favor of Russia could result in, I mean, it has to be very calculated, but let's see. I mean, interesting times ahead, that's what I can say. Nasir, it was a pleasure having you, sir. Thank you so much. And ma'am, it was a pleasure having you as well. And thank you so much, Mr. Naderi, for your time, sir. And best of luck. We hope and we do pray that issues are sorted out between the West and Iranians. And at the end of the day, obviously, Iranians are our brothers, next door neighbors, and it is going to definitely benefit Pakistan also. And that's all we have for this. I'll see you tomorrow at 8:05 p.m. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.